I'm going to be using certain terms interchangeably. Motion graphics, motion design, motion graphic design, and probably also animation, because I tend to use that interchangeably as well. I get a lot of questions about what exactly is motion graphics. So technically the term motion graphics is a shortened form of motion graphic design. Okay? And really what it is a very specific subset of animation. Okay? So we'll call ourselves animators a lot. Motion graphic designers call themselves animators a lot. Motion designers. When I went to school, this was called broadcast design, because the only people who really did it were for broadcast television. But that's changed a lot over the last, honestly, several decades. Okay? So when I say the word animation, a lot of people think of something like this. Okay. So, for the record, by the way, if anyone doesn't know that, that's from 1985. It's the Thundercats intro. And yes, I was alive at that time. And that's what most people think of when I say animation. Not specifically that show, but the idea of two-dimensional moving characters. So people think of Snow White. They think of Cinderella. They think of Bambi. Or my kids would think of things like Shrek or The Little Mermaid or that sort of thing. Now, some people, when I say the word animation, might think of this. By the way, this is an updated version of that same intro. So someone actually made a new updated version of that in 3D, which is actually pretty cool. But same idea. People may think of Shrek, or they may think of The Incredibles, or one of the many other 3D animated films that we see. Okay, so usually when people think of animation, this is what they're thinking of. Thinking of cartoon-style animation. Whether that is traditionally drawn, as in the 1985 Thundercats opening, or whether it is 3D animated, as in this 2020 version by the artist Mike Booth, it's still the same idea. It's characters in a story, and things are happening. But when I say animation, and I'm speaking about motion graphics, I'm more likely than not talking about something like this. So usually when I'm talking motion graphics, something like that. It's now, this is one style of motion graphics. So this is also motion graphics. So this is motion graphics as well. Basically, there are many different types of animation. Motion graphics or motion graphic design or motion design, whatever you want to call it, is one of them. And there's a lot of disagreement exactly on what the overlap is. The two examples I showed of traditional cartoon character animation, one was two-dimensional, one was three-dimensional. The first one from '85 was hand-drawn. The second one clearly was not. The two examples of motion graphic design. One of them was two-dimensional, flat, two-dimensional shapes, and the other used 3D models. That world and that ship were 3D models. Okay? So it's not necessarily the drawing style that defines the difference, like at all. The main difference, how I usually describe it, is that for motion design there may or may not be a narrative. It's not usually character-driven. And it's usually for either commercial purposes or promotional purposes. So effectively, it is an extension of usually of graphic design. Okay, very often animated graphic design, and some of the oldest, what we would call motion designers, or for film, what we would call title designers, actually, were originally graphic designers, and many of them actually continue doing that along with their animation. Okay. So it's a gray area to an extent. Some people will ask, like, well, what tools do you use? And the answer is it varies massively from one motion designer to another. So keep that in mind. Effectively, that's where they laid out the 12 principles of animation. There's a bunch of links here that give you different examples of them, though they're all the same principles with different examples. The entertainment one basically uses, like, I think rectangles and stuff to do it. But the idea is that you're dealing with an attempt to make things not necessarily look alive, but more interesting and appealing to the user. So character animation is a part of that, by the way. But these examples all use really, really simple graphics. We're not talking about Cinderella. We're not talking about Snow White. But they're able to create appealing, engaging content, very often with just some boxes that are moving. Which is interesting. Okay. Now, so there's also going to be a couple of other links to these at the end of the presentation for anyone who wants them. There are, if you're interested in animation, watching people try to explain the principles of animation are really helpful. There have been others over the years who've reduced some of them to fit more with computer animation. There have been some that have added more principles. I think I saw one today that was talking about, 21 principles of animation. Okay. So each animator adds things and sometimes subtracts things. Not everything actually fits in every environment. But at its simplest, the principles of design and the principles of animation combine together in motion graphics design. Okay. While many motion graphics projects are not character-driven per se, I mean, some are, most are not character-driven, there's still an attempt to create an engaging, appealing work. Okay. So, what goes into a motion design project? Okay. Lots of things, basically. Now, again, some of these mimic what you might have done if you are in print design, or graphic design, or web design. Okay. I learned about concepts and briefs from web design probably 20 years ago. Okay. Scripts. If you're into filmmaking, maybe you're familiar with scripts. Okay. But there are certain things that are unique to an animation or a motion design project. Okay. So this is some of the things that you actually might have to create. So let's look at them. So a concept or brief, again, this exists in basically almost all design environments I've been into, or at least we're told they should. Okay. So it's basically a description of what you're going to be producing. A synopsis. Okay. This, for example, showed animation of text and graphics timed the original Superman TV show intro audio. Okay, I have an example of that, by the way, if you're not familiar with it. This actually is the Max Fleischer from the 30s, I think, Superman intro they're talking about. Okay. Well, there's text in that. For those of you who aren't familiar, by the way, it's the one that goes faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive. That's this, if you're not familiar with it. Okay. So this actually has a voiceover. And this is an AV script. It actually lists the aspects of the voiceover, the audio, and the proposed visuals to go along with it. Okay. This particular one has reference links to various imagery you might be considering using. Okay. But faster than a speeding bullet. Black text on a white area with blue background and angle. Okay. That's an AV script. It's once we've got the synopsis, once we've got, in this case, the audio we're going to use, script we're going to use, this was the voiceover in this case, trying to figure out what visuals would go along with it before we ever draw anything or start assembling assets. This is very common. Okay. Now, the problem with an AV script is that it's just text. And there's a limit to that. So one of the things that you do, because this is a visual environment, is start assembling graphics. You might actually create style frames. Style frames, what are they called? I think in web design they're called style tiles. And basically, yeah, the style is a more design thing actually. They're basically drawings that represent the style and look and feel of the graphic you're going to be using. This is actually from that Superman example. Okay, this was the style we're using. Flat artwork, very, very bright colors, very, very, very tight, straight lines, especially for like the graphics and stuff and the starbursts. And they're used before we spend time animating anything to get client approval on the look and feel of this work. If you're used to making mood boards, basically these usually come after mood boards if you're doing them. And while mood boards are gathering different assets together, style tiles are demonstrating your particular style of artwork. Because remember, motion design doesn't have one style. Certain designers may, but the medium itself doesn't. So is this going to be using flat artwork, which is very popular now? Is it going to be using 3D modeled artwork? Or is it going to be using a combination of both? Okay. If it's going to be flat, how flat is it going to be? Okay. And that's what style frames help you demonstrate and help you show. Okay. The problem again, style frames are basically cutouts of what's happening. So this is what it's going to look like. But that's not animation. That's a static image, like a painting. Storyboards. Usually the style frames are taken and expanded out to be storyboards to explain how you're going to get from one style frame, one image, to the other. Because effectively, animation is a matter of, it's a time-based medium. So we start with this faster than a speeding bullet graphic. Then we bring in a graphic of more powerful locomotive, able to leap tall buildings, and so on and so forth. Okay. Most storyboards start off hand-drawn. For the record, do you have to be able to draw? Not really. Most animators who are not who don't draw by hand. Most computer animators can draw simple graphics and shapes to represent their storyboards for what they're trying to express. Okay. If you've ever seen storyboards that have been like published, they collect them in books sometimes, or like making behind the scenes of stuff, very often those are done by professional illustrators. But the first level of storyboard, again, it's a tool for understanding how you're going to get from one image to the next. Okay. Usually, at some point, they get put into software, or they get drawn up by someone who can draw well. These actually, I think, were done in Illustrator, actually. And it gives you now a look of color and feel. For those of you who do print and web design, think of them in the same way that most people think of mock-ups. Okay? The initial storyboards on, again, literally paper, usually think of them as wireframes, like website wireframes, where you're basically trying to show the structure of content, while the mock-ups actually give you a better idea of what it's going to look and feel like. Okay. Now, the problem with what I just said about the storyboards is effectively they're still static. They actually don't give me a very good representation of how this is going to move. How is it going to get from one point to the other? And how long is it actually going to take? How long does it take to say those things? More powerful than a locomotive. Okay. In that case, we have animatics.
Faster than a speeding bullet. More powerful than a locomotive. Able to leap tall buildings at a single bound. This amazing stranger from the planet Krypton. The Man of Steel. Superman. Possessing remarkable physical strength, Superman fights a never-ending battle for truth and justice.
Animatics very often are simply the storyboards to music. What they basically give you is an idea of, for a voiceover, how long is it going to take? How long am I going to hold this particular shot for? Okay. This one was simply the straight mocked up storyboards, the color and everything, and just held for as long as the voiceover goes to give a sense of pacing and timing. Animatics sometimes will include very limited animation. They're part of the pre-visualization stage of the animation, so you haven't spent time fully animating your character, but it can give you an idea of how it's going to, again, look, how it's going to feel, how it's going to move, and very often, how is it going to get from one shot to the next? Okay, that's an animatic. Okay. They're also used in the film and television industries now, to, especially for high concept film, things that like would require a lot of work. if you're going to do basically a massive fight scene, you're probably going to want to block it out with an animatic to figure out actually how's your camera going to move, how's it going to move around, how are you going to hold each shot. And it's become, there's software now that does it for you that can help you, again, block out these things before you actually spend the time and money making them. Okay? But in animation, this is very often what animatics are. Okay? So, a lot of things go into this. A lot of things. How does it get paid for? Because that's usually the next question. Well, who pays for these things? Okay, so again, this is a really simplified breakdown of what's being created. Okay, concept brief, script, AV script, animatics, rough animation, that sort of thing. Okay. Now, there's a lot more that goes into this, especially if you're actually running a project. And again, for those of you who are art directors, creative directors, it's very similar to the graphic design process or workflow in how projects get budgeted out and how they get organized. But again, certain things. A script. Now, this might be equivalent to copywriting in the traditional design industry, okay? But who's writing the script? Because someone's got to write it. Okay? I can write basic copy, but I'm not a writer, per se. Okay? Most projects need some type of script. Even if it's just explaining what's happening, what you're going to be animating, it needs something, okay? And if you're working with a client, are they writing the script? Do they know what they're doing? Have they written the script before? Okay? Or are you writing it? Okay? Or you have to hire somebody, because that takes time and money and explanation. Okay? So people don't think about that everything that you've seen, someone wrote a script for. Okay? Even the simplest TV commercial, even the simplest 10-second, 15-second spot on Instagram, someone wrote a script for. Okay? And maybe that script is dialogue. Maybe that script is not dialogue. It varies. Okay? Maybe, again, I'm just explaining what's happening. But someone's got to write it. Okay? Who's making the style tiles? Do you have characters? Who's designing them? Okay? Who's deciding the look and feel of these things? Okay? And is the client providing the assets? Are those assets ready to be animated? Because they may not be. Okay? One of my oldest jobs many, many years ago was actually preparing graphics for print. And it surprised me. This is about 30 years ago, actually. And a lot of clients didn't actually have print-ready graphics. So we spent a lot of time recreating them. And the same is true for animation. You may have a photograph of your logo. That's nice. You may have a JPEG of your logo. Okay. I can't really animate a JPEG well. There's no pieces to it. Okay? And logo animation is one of the things motion graphic designers do. Done a bunch of it. So, where does that come from? Who's providing it and how long is it going to take? Okay. Audio. That's the biggest thing that people forget. There's incidental music, background music, sound effects. Are you doing a voiceover? Who's recording that voiceover? How are you getting it? These are all things that actually go into the creation of the project that very often people forget about. And they take time. It's not just opening up After Effects and making stuff. There's a lot of things that go into that workflow long before you ever open your software. Okay. The voiceover, for example, animation to a voiceover, the voiceover has to be done first because you're animating to the voiceover. Okay. Do you need video for this project? Or is it something created with assets in Photoshop, Illustrator, images? Varies. Okay. I've had clients who shoot their own video. Sometimes that works out really well. Sometimes it works out horribly, by the way. Okay. Are you going to shoot the video? Or you have to hire somebody? These are all things that go into a motion graphics project that you have to consider, you have to worry about. Okay. And then what are you turning over to your client? So once everything is done, once everything is finished, what is the client actually getting? Is this going to be an animation for television, which has its own standards and settings? Is this going to be a video to play on Instagram, which has completely different, by the way, standards and settings and dimensions and everything else? Okay. If all you've ever produced are still images, it may not occur to you that video actually has to be rendered. And that rendering can take a while. Actually, the producing of the video. And usually when something's being rendered on your computer, the computer's useless to you. Hey, there are cloud rendering services, but they cost money and have really complex, sometimes, methods of figuring out how much you're going to pay them. Okay? So all these things go into that final deliverable project. Okay? This is my favorite quote, by the way. By me, by the way, I might add. The client pays for everything in the end. Just got to figure out which end it's coming out of. Theirs or yours. But I mean, they're paying for everything. I mean, if the client pays me to do stuff, they're either paying directly or I'm paying for it and getting reimbursed. That's how I work. Nothing comes out of what I'm getting paid for my fee. Okay. So again, that's a basic breakdown again of the aspects of what you're doing. Okay. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, AIGA is basically American Institute of Graphic Arts. It's a trade organization of graphic artists. They actually, if you're interested, have a series of standardized agreements to go through a proposal for creating a project. If you're not familiar with them, they're actually pretty cool. Their subscription, you basically can be a member if you want, but their information is available perfectly for free. So if you're interested in trying to figure out what am I going to need to produce for my clients? How do I agree with them upon what to be produced? That's where this standard agreement for design services might come in handy. They actually, last time I checked, do not have one specifically for motion design, but they have one for web design, they have one for graphic design services, and a couple others. And usually, the graphic design ones and the video one actually usually fit. So, it's tweaked. One of the issues, by the way, with information on motion design is a lot of the traditional graphic design organizations don't actually track motion design as a field. Not yet. I mean, they've kind of started, but it varies. So finding information on how to write a contract, how to write a proposal can be a little tricky. But it's there. Okay. And yes, by the way, you'll want to have a contract. Okay. So I'm old. I'm in my late 40s actually. And when I first started, I would often work for smaller clients, and I would often not have a contract. That was a mistake. Take my word for it. Have a contract, okay? Okay. Simply for spelling out what it is you're going to be doing and what you're going to get paid for doing it. So we talk about this in our portfolio class, actually. We try to prepare people for actually working in the industry. And one of the things we talk about is contracts. And I really recommend you have a contract. It's like, I don't know how to say it other than that, basically. And I usually suggest, by the way, you have a lawyer prepare your contract for you. But there are, again, services online that'll do that for you. Things to keep in mind. 5 Ds. Duration, dimension, due date, dollars, and deliverables. Okay? Every contract specify those, and, again, have a lot more detail. I'm not a lawyer. To get my master's, I had to take 1 class in law, so I just know enough to know when to ask a lawyer. But the point of a contract, point of a good contract anyway, is to specify what you can provide and what the client wants, and to help align those goals. There's nothing worse than the client expecting you to provide something that you didn't agree to. So, be aware. It's fine. Okay? And again, that. Make a detailed contract. Okay? The more detailed the contract is, the less room for misunderstanding you'll have. Okay. And again, if you're interested, we actually do get more into this in our portfolio class. Okay. There's things you got to think about: the number of iterations for your design, the whether you need 2D, 3D animation, that sort of thing. Are you doing character animation, which, by the way, again, is its own specialization inside of motion design? You can have general animators, you can have character animators. They're not the same thing. Not at all, usually. Okay. So, again, you want to think about everything that's going to be necessary to create your project, and that's what your contract should include. Okay. And again, if you can afford a lawyer to go over one for you, it's probably safer. Okay. Now, money. I get this asked a lot. What do motion designers make? Okay. I get asked this, by the way, a lot, especially for people who are interested in moving into motion design from other industries. So, here's the basic problem. there is a really, really wide range in salaries and freelance rates, depending on where you are. I'm from New York City. I grew up in New York City, actually. So I've basically only ever worked in New York and LA. So I'm used to New York and LA rates. But there are a lot of people throughout the United States doing motion design. There are also a lot of people throughout the world doing motion design. So there's a really wide range in what you can make for this. Okay? And it makes getting information a bit tricky. Okay? Now, one place for information is AIGA, American Institute of Graphic Arts. They have a design census. They used to call it something else, but now they call it the design census. The last one was from 2019, at least the last one I could find, by the way. And the entire point of the design census was to basically, they talked to almost 10,000 people, and they're basically trying to get a sense of the design industry in the United States. They break it down by region, they break it down by actually city sometimes actually too, and by area of design. So you've got filmmakers in with graphic designers, in with art directors, in with creative directors, in with animators. It's actually pretty cool. Prior to, I think, 2019, they called it something else. I think they just called it the salary survey. But if you check out their website, you can actually find back several years of this census they do. Now, here's the problem. Again, finding good information involves having the right questions asked. So they had several areas. The last I could find for their salary survey, 2014, they listed motion and video editors as the same thing. So motion designers, video editors, which are technically two different jobs. Okay, and they were looking at a $50,000 or so average throughout the United States. Okay, not great, but not bad. Still, actually, that's actually above average for the U.S. Okay, now, but they also had motion graphic designer, animator. Again, similar but different job title, and they were a bit higher. Okay, so the wages were skewing a little higher than traditional print design, but again, still the design industry. Okay, now other places to find information. Job sites. Glassdoor, for example, actually has a lot of information on current salaries for people in the industries, and Glassdoor had an average of about $71,000 for people with the title of motion graphic designer, animator. Okay, pay scale was a little lower, but again, still same general range. But if you look at the high and low, that was anywhere from $51,000 to $94,000. Okay, so a lot of this information on salaries, again, it's hard to find concrete information. But if you look at the sampling of various places, it does give you a general idea of what people in this industry are making. Okay, that was salary.com again for motion graphic designer, animator. Yeah. Depending on where you are, very comfortable. Okay. This is a blog post from School of Motion, if anyone's interested, and they were looking at anywhere full-time employees around $60K, freelance about mid of that. So again, it's you're not going to become millionaire wealthy more likely than not, but you shouldn't starve. Okay. This is an example of a post from actually Indeed.com for senior motion graphic designer, and if you read through it, it's interesting because some of the things that are being asked for here are really, really interesting. So one of the problems in motion design is that technically this is not a new field, but a lot of the places that are hiring people for it aren't asking the right questions, I would say, a lot of times. So there's a lot of places that are, again, medium range salaries, and places that are very, very high. So there's a lot of flexibility in this industry for what people are making. Okay, that from a few years ago was the typical starting freelancer rates. You were looking anywhere from between $30 and $50 an hour for freelancers. Companies were actually charging several $1,000s per minute of content. So again, it varies. Some agencies actually just bill out their hourly rates like advertising agencies do. Some actually were bidding per project, and some were bidding per minute of content or per second of content. It actually varied. So again, there's a lot of variety in the industry about how things are billed and how people are getting paid. So basically, there's no standardization. There just isn't. Okay. That was motion graphics rate, 60 an hour, 5,000 a minute. In New York City, it was varying. So again, usually the bigger cities are going to have more competition, but also a considerably higher average rate. That was typical starting rates. That was actually for the average rates of existing motion designers. Okay. Now, if you're interested in freelance work, there are places like Upwork where you can basically work from the comfort of your own home. Okay. The top 4 designers had an average rate of $47 an hour, okay, which again isn't bad, depending again on what you do and how many hours a week you work. That was the range. It was actually anywhere from $38 to $90. So again, a lot of range on these international freelancing sites. So there's again a large discrepancy between people at the lower end of the spectrum and at the higher end of the spectrum. But especially in New York City, again, where I'm from, there is a lot of After Effects users and a lot of After Effects work. So again, it depends. That was Fiverr. Not my favorite place, but it's actually interesting. A lot of work gets done from there. And again, their average was a little higher, $47.50 an hour. But they had a much wider range of their top 8 motion designers. So it was, again, a lot of variation, because for these sites, you're competing with people internationally. Okay. If you're interested, there's an animator on YouTube, Ben Marriott. I follow him. He's got a great channel. And he actually hired 6 motion designers to redesign his channel intro. And it was actually really interesting about, it wasn't always, especially for the Fire site, it wasn't always about how much he paid. Some of the people that he basically had a much lower hourly rate and much lower total rate had some really interesting results. So it's a lot of variation in this. Okay. No. So that's our introduction to motion graphic design. If you're interested, Noble Desktop has classes on After Effects and video editing, Premiere Pro. We actually have a certificate program for motion graphic design. And in that class, we cover software, but we also have a portfolio class where we actually build content and we learn more about salaries and how to write contracts and that sort of thing. So we're attempting to prepare people who are actually entering into the industry. That sort of thing. Okay. Questions? This is the time for questions. No questions? Really? No questions? Come on, somebody ask a question. It makes me feel, like, helpful. Okay, go. Yeah, okay. Good question. I get that a lot. What software do I recommend learning first? Okay, so, again, the most common motion design program is probably After Effects. But After Effects, as I'm going to show you, actually, After Effects doesn't work that well by itself. Usually assets are created in Photoshop or Illustrator. So normally I suggest that the first thing you should know, again for an animation program, After Effects definitely, but you're going to need to know at least some Photoshop to be able to either create your own assets or to prepare them for use in After Effects. So for your animation program, After Effects. For your graphics program, Photoshop or Illustrator. And it depends. A lot of people, I remember when Adobe had a stat, it was like 85% of After Effects users also used Photoshop. And this was several years ago, only about 12% used Illustrator. But one of the key areas, especially that I do now, is actually infographic design. And most of the time I'm animating infographics, I'm getting those assets from Illustrator. So I have to use Illustrator to either make those myself or to prep them and adjust them. So I'd usually recommend Photoshop and Illustrator for your graphics creation and editing, at least just a little bit of understanding of how to actually prep stuff, separate it to layers, and then After Effects for animation. Okay. If you want to add stuff after that, if you're considering adding video into your motion graphics work, Premiere Pro or some other video editing program like Final Cut, and if you want to do 3D, right now the program that integrates best for 3D into After Effects is Cinema 4D from Maxon. That's my recommendation. But yeah, start with Photoshop and After Effects. I'm probably the worst person to ask that question to, Cheryl. So Cheryl asks, how difficult would you say it is to learn After Effects if you already know Illustrator, Photoshop? Okay, I'm going to show you guys After Effects. So I don't... Did I mention my software credentials before I started this? Because this is not a software class. I don't think I did, actually. Okay, so I'm an Adobe certified expert in Photoshop, Illustrator, After Effects, and Premiere Pro. The Photoshop After Effects Premiere thing gets me a certification called Certified Video Expert, basically. And I've written books on, by the way, in the software. So I'm pretty familiar with how Photoshop, Illustrator, and After Effects are similar to each other. Knowing Photoshop and or Illustrator helps you learn After Effects to an extent. There are certain concepts that are the same. Also depending on what you've done in Photoshop, by the way. The problem is a lot of those similarities are just topical. So like, they both have layers, Photoshop, Illustrator, After Effects. But each of those programs has a very different implementation of how layers work. So the more software you know, the more you can look for similarities between the software you know and the software you're learning, the easier it is to learn new software. Our chief instructor, Dan, actually jokes that because of all the software he knows right now, it's much easier for him to learn new things, because when he's looking at new software, he's basically looking at how it fits with what he already knows, and it's basically just, hey, this is similar to that, this is similar to that. He's making those connections. So After Effects, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, is the hardest program Adobe makes. End of story, I'd argue. I'd say it is. But that's why we have classes, actually, because it helps. But the more software you're familiar with, the easier it is to learn. And it's definitely an approachable program once you get used to it. But yeah, it's on a scale of 1 to 10, how hard is After Effects to learn? I don't know, 7 maybe? I don't know. But that's entirely, for the record, my opinion. I think, again, the more software you know, the easier it is to look for similar things. And I'm always suggesting people, when they're learning software, look at how it compares to things you already know how to do. Not even in software, but like, there are similarities in After Effects, for the record, and PowerPoint. There are. So look for those similarities, and it helps you learn new things and new techniques. Cool. Questions? Okay, so for pure video editing, most of them use Premiere Pro. That's what it does. It basically cuts video and audio together. After Effects, while technically, yes, it can edit video, After Effects is really more of a motion graphics and animation program and a compositing program. So yeah, so if you're looking for pure video editing, where you're basically cutting together and want to make it like a TV show or something, Premiere Pro. Definitely do it in Premiere Pro. Okay. The certificates are mostly software-based. We do have some non-software components, like in our motion graphics part. We cover storyboarding there. So usually in our motion graphics certificate, it's the portfolio class, which is run over several weeks, by the way, that covers things like storyboarding and style frame creation and that sort of thing, how to actually work through a project. Most of the actual software classes are focused mostly on software acquisition. Okay. Cool. Now, that being said, there actually are non-software classes that are also taught at Noble, where they basically are design principles and graphic design concepts and that sort of thing. But yeah, most of the actual, if the class has After Effects, it's basically going to be teaching you After Effects and how to use it. A lot of our projects, though, are actually focused on, especially in After Effects, looking at the complete process of creating projects from beginning to end. Some of them are, here, do this one thing, but most of them are about how to balance a project and how to actually combine assets together from beginning to end of a project. So they're kind of a more holistic approach. Okay. And by the way, those classes are that Noble teaches are basically a combination of lecture like this was, but also actual hands-on practice, because we feel the best way to learn something is to actually doing it. So in those, if you've taken our introduction to After Effects or Photoshop or Illustrator, or again our evening sessions, Those are actually more like what our classes are, where you basically start to demo something and then you complete the exercises to do it. Any other questions? Okay. So there's a couple concepts that are actually universal to most motion graphics work. Some of them are concepts that you might find in Photoshop or Illustrator. So I'll do this until we're out of time. Layers, timelines, frame rate, keyframes, and integration of software. Okay, so yes, I'm going to end that, and I'm going to open up Illustrator. Let me actually close that. I'm going to go to my Illustrator. Yes, by the way, I have like every piece of software Adobe makes. So let's say I wanted to make an animation in After Effects. And let's say I want to make an animation of a donut. Now, After Effects is not a drawing program. I'm not going to be drawing a donut in After Effects. Trust me. I mean, in theory, you might be able to do it. I would not try. Okay, so I made this actual little graphic earlier today. All right. Now, layers. So layers exist in pretty much every program that lets you make content, really, I'd argue at this point. And right now what I have is a donut layer, donut highlight layer, frosting highlight layer, sprinkles, and text. That's how I created this file. Okay, I'm going to turn those back on. Now, I accept text. I'll leave text off for now. So each of my pieces of content is on its own layer, and basically the idea is, this is Illustrator by the way, so I'm viewing my transparency grid, which is that grid. It indicates transparent areas. And basically when you have a layer, let me actually solo frosting. Okay. By the way, if you're not familiar with it, to solo a layer, it's on Mac, Option, and click on the eye. That basically hides every other layer. Excuse me, sorry. Okay, so basically, the way layers work is each bit of content you have can be stacked above or below other bits of content. So my frosting is here right in the middle. It's above the donut base, which is just the color of the donut. And then there's a little highlight right between them. So the frosting covers the parts of the highlight that it's on top of. So layers are always dealing with transparent and opaque areas, basically. And the opaque areas cover whatever they're above, and the transparent areas you just see right through. Like that. Okay? And this is basically how you create more and more complex graphics, more and more layers. Okay? Now, for those of you who use Illustrator, anybody here use Illustrator? Illustrator? Okay, cool. So, do you use layers in Illustrator? Because a lot of Illustrator users, by the way, don't. The problem is that if I'm going to take this into After Effects, I need layers. So a lot of Illustrator doesn't make me use layers to make complex artwork. Photoshop does, by the way, but Illustrator doesn't. But if I want this in After Effects to be animatable so I can control these separately, I need them to be different layers. So that's why I broke these out into their own layers. Okay, I'm just going to save that. Okay. Now, I'm going to go to After Effects. I have a lot of things open. Okay. Let me open After Effects. Woohoo, After Effects. Okay. So a lot of graphics are made in Photoshop or Illustrator because, like I said, After Effects is not a drawing program per se. And in general, what happens is you end up with usually layered assets from Photoshop or Illustrator, and you need to bring them into After Effects. Okay, so when this opens, I'll do that. Okay. This is After Effects. And this is actually it loading my presets, which are right over here, by the way. After Effects has a lot of preset animations that you can apply to stuff like text and other layers. And my disk cache is, well, it uses part of my hard drive as a source temporary files. I'm just going to close that. Okay. So After Effects has two main uses: motion graphic design, or animation really, and video compositing. Those are its two main uses. So for animation, I'm going to bring in my Illustrator file. So I'm going to import it, file, import, file. Yes, by the way, we use the word import, not place in After Effects. Okay, and that's the great donut. Donut here it is. So that's an Illustrator file. I can bring in native Photoshop and Illustrator files and After Effects, no problem whatsoever. And if I make the right options, import as, not footage. Composition, retain layer sizes. That'll actually bring in the Illustrator file. It will bring it in with each individual layer intact and its original position. And what it does is it turns the Illustrator file into a composition. Compositions in After Effects are basically where you animate things. They're the equivalent of documents. Okay, so I'm going to double click on open that. That is the donut I had in Illustrator, now here in After Effects. All the layers are there. That text layer had been turned off in Illustrator. It's turned off here, but it's right there if I need it. No problem at all. Okay, so this is layers. And After Effects layers can be made from Illustrator or Photoshop files directly like this. No problem at all. Now, another feature that you have in animation programs especially, whether it's Photoshop, whether it's After Effects, whether it's Animate, or even Premiere Pro, video editing program, is a timeline. Video is a time-based medium, so things happen over time. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. Timelines are where you make your keyframes. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take this donut composition. I'm going to make another composition. Something to put this donut in so it's all together. That's my new composition button right there in After Effects. It looks like a little film strip. I'm just going to call this main animation. And I'm going to set a size. This is the standard high-def television that we broadcast, 1080. Okay. So compositions have dimensions. Compositions have frame rate. Another common principle. All video is, all animation is a series of still images played very, very, very fast. The frame rate is how fast. 29.97 is the American television standard. If you're doing film, maybe you would do 24. Okay. So this is what the composition has. It's basically your video settings. It also has a duration, a length. I'm just going to make this 30 seconds. Okay. I do not have a zoom in on that. That is time code. It's how you measure where you are along your timeline. Because again, it's a time-based medium. Things happen at the beginning, middle, or end of your timeline. And time code is how you figure out where you are. This was 30 seconds, 0 frames. Background color, I'm going to ignore. And I'm just going to say OK. And that's my new main animation composition. There's nothing here, though. So I'm going to grab my donut comp that I imported from Illustrator, drag it in, and now I have a donut right in the middle. And I want to animate the position of this donut. So every layer has its parts. Position, anchor point, rotation, opacity, and scale. And these are what you can animate in order to change this. I want this donut to start off very, very small and then basically scale up and pop up. So I want to animate its scale. Okay. On my timeline, I create another one of our key concepts, keyframes. Keyframes basically are used to set the properties at certain points in time. So I'm just going to change this. This little blue wedge is called my playhead. You've got one in video editing programs. You've got one in animation programs. You got one in Photoshop. You look at its timeline. That's the current time indicator it's called here. I'll put it at the beginning. I'm going to change my scale to 0. Just click on it, 0. I now do not see a donut because my donut is 0 scale. Okay. It's horizontal and vertical. That's 2 numbers. Now, this is what happened to the donut for all time. It's now gone. The only way to get it back is to add keyframes. So keyframes allow me to change each of these properties over time. So at one point in time, they're this. Later, they're something else. One of our key concepts, keyframes. To make keyframes in this program, I click on the stopwatch to the left of any property. If you see a stopwatch like that in Adobe software, it means you can animate this. You can change it over time. Scale. And then now it's 0. To make a second keyframe, I go any place else on my timeline. I'm just going to go to 15 frames, by the way. Okay. I can't actually see the number 15 here, but I can zoom in with this little scroll wheel on the bottom. And I'm going to make this 100% again. When I go back to the beginning and press spacebar to preview, that's the result. It gets bigger. But you know, I think if I were to just go a couple frames back, maybe right there, around 12 or so. I think it might be cool if this got a little bigger, 125. So I'm thinking maybe if it exaggerated past its final size and then came back, that might be kind of cool. That's interesting. I can go for that. Maybe that keyframe should be a little closer to the middle. I can just drag it. That pop's a little aggressive. I'm thinking I'm using one of the principles of animation called slow in, slow out, which we call easing, by the way. I'm going to right-click on that middle keyframe, Assistant, Easy Ease. This is basically going to give me a slow entry and a slow exit into the keyframe, so it's basically not quite so abrupt how it settles back into position. So I'm using one of the principles of animation, exaggeration, and I'm using another one, slow in, slow out, to make a little more believable motion. Like that. Like that. Okay. And I'm thinking I'm going to add a little rotation to this. So I'm going to make that rotation 90 degrees. Back at the beginning. Stopwatch for another keyframe. I go to the end where I have that last keyframe. If I hold down Shift, it'll snap, by the way, to that keyframe. And I'll make it 0. Just type in a new 0. So now basically it rotates in and scales up simultaneously. Like that. So I can get a little motion on that one. So those are some of our key concepts in working with graphics. Layers, timelines, keyframes, and I even introduced a couple of our principles of animation. Exaggeration with my overshoot of the size, and slow in, slow out, which in computer graphics they call easing, to give it that pop, make it a little less aggressive, a little more realistic. Look at that. And I've got some really quick animation with that I can then add to.